Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody, wherever you are, and welcome to the 10th Journal Club of IFSO, a very exciting one for sure. We're going to be talking about the most talked about trial since November in the presentation in Obesity Week, and it's a privilege and an honor to have Professor Maud Robert with us. Professor Robert is from the Digestive and Bariatric Department in Edouard Herriot Hospital in Lyon, France. Welcome, Professor Robert.
Thank you.
Before we actually go into the presentation of Professor Robert, a couple of announcements. The article itself is in the handouts sheet on the right-hand side. If you haven't read it, please download it, as well as the visual abstract. Also, type in your question in the question segment if you have any, and we'll get to them at the end, hopefully. And before we start the presentation, we're going to launch the first poll. The first poll after the Omega trial, please select one of the following. And please go ahead and answer. And I'll ask Professor Robert about her view, which is the conclusion of the trial itself. Were you surprised, Professor Robert?
By our results, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah, we were quite surprised, actually. I think that most of us were thinking that we will have better results in terms of weight loss and metabolic outcomes with the one anastomosis gastric bypass. So yeah, we were quite surprised.
Great, and I'll share the result of the audience. Only 8% believe that 200 centimeters should never be done, and 31% believe that 150 is the common limb length, and 54 majority actually believe we need more longer-term quality. And with that, we'll start with the presentation. Please, Professor Robert, go ahead.
Okay. So I will talk today about the Omega trial, which tried to assess the efficacy and safety of one anastomosis gastric bypass versus Roux-en-Y gastric bypass. This was a multi-center randomized open-label non-inferiority trial conducted in France. Let's do it. Yeah. So we all know that one anastomosis gastric bypass is increasingly performed worldwide. And this technique was described in the 2000s, derived from the loop gastric bypass by Mason, and was closed to Billroad 2 reconstruction. So the advantages put forward by the proponents of the techniques was that it was less technically demanding, potentially less morbid, because of a unique anastomosis, and probably because of less internal hernia, especially as you don't divide the mesentery. And some published data in the literature show more weight loss and better metabolic outcomes with this procedure. So nevertheless, it is still controversial. And if we try to understand the objections to one anastomosis gastric bypass, we can look at this published study by Mahawar in 2017, questioning 417 surgeons not performing this procedure. And you can see that 51% had fear of gastric cancer, 45% had fear of esophageal cancer, 15% and 49% thought that there were more early and late complications than with the Roux-en-Y, and 63% of the surgeons said that the technique was not approved by their national scientific society. So obviously, there is still the controversy, and literature are quite poor. We have mainly retrospective studies with 2 randomized control trials published previously. The first one was performed by Lee in 2005 with 80 patients included, 2 years of follow-up. The authors concluded that one anastomosis gastric bypass is simpler and safer, but the calculation of the sample size was done to see the difference in the operative time. The second trial was performed was published in 2018 by Ruiz Tobar team with 200 sleeve compared to 200 one anastomosis gastric bypass to 200 Roux-en-Y gastric bypass with a 5-year follow-up. The authors concluded that one anastomosis do better than Roux-en-Y regarding weight loss and metabolic outcomes. Nevertheless, both of these trials have a criticable methodology with no previously published protocols on official sites. So clearly, we can see that there is a lack of data of a high scientific value, as confirmed by the first consensus of IFSO in 2018. And clearly, efficacy and safety of one anastomosis gastric bypass are still an actual debate, especially if you look at the several randomized trials that are currently in process. So the methods of our work. So Omega was a multi-center randomized control trial of non-inferiority, comparing one anastomosis to Roux-en-Y gastric bypass. The primary endpoint was the excess BMI loss percentage at 2 years, and the technique was a biliopancreatic limb of 2 meters in the one anastomosis gastric bypass arm, and an alimentary of 1.5 meters in the Roux-en-Y arm with a biliary limb of 50 centimeters. So the study design, the protocol was written in 2013, and we started after obtaining the financial possibility in May 2014. You can see that we had 9 high-volume institutions who participated. Inclusion criteria was standard. We excluded patients with a history of esophagitis or Barrett's esophagus, severe GERD, history of previous bariatric surgery. Randomization was equal 1 to 1. We plan to include 128 patients in both arms. We stopped the study in March 2018 after 2 years of follow-up for every patient. We performed at 2 years an upper GI endoscopy with biopsies, which was systematic. We had the assessment of steatorrhea at 6 months of follow-up, and we also had the follow-up of weight loss, metabolic and nutritional profile, diarrhea, GERD, adverse events, quality of life, anti-diabetic, hypertensive, and lipidemic drugs, and also at the assessment of dumping syndrome. So the results of our trial. So you can see the baseline characteristics of the population here. We had 117 patients in the per protocol population in both arms. Just try to see if we had the flow chart. Sorry, no. So mean age was about 42, 44. Male gender was about 22 and 27%. Mean BMI nearly 44. We had only 12% of patients with BMI over 50. We had about 29% of diabetes patients in both groups. Mean HbA1c was nearly 7.8. Mean duration of type 2 diabetes in both groups was 7.8 years, and nearly 30% of patients in both groups were on insulin. So here is the flow chart. So you can see that 261 patients were initially included. We had to exclude 8 patients because 1 finally declined to participate to the study. 3 patients, we didn't found the written consent for 3 patients, so we couldn't assess the data. one was excluded because of a serious adverse event before surgery, and it was a acidotic coma due to type 2 diabetes, and 3 patients were in fact included after the end of recruitment. So finally, we were able to randomize 253 patients, 124 in the RANY arm, 129 in the one anastomosis gastric bypass arm. You can see that we had also to exclude patients, 3 in the RANY arm because they did not undergo a sign surgery. One had an anesthetic shock and was not operated. One was converted to one anastomosis gastric bypass and another to sleeve because of operative difficulties. In the one anastomosis arm, 2 did not have their procedure, one because of finally a refusal, and one was wrongly included. In fact, he had gastric banding, which was an exclusion criteria. So finally, 121 patients had a RANY, 127 had a one anastomosis gastric bypass procedure, and then we all had to exclude patients from the per protocol analysis because of pregnancies, withdrawal of consent. We had 2 deaths which were not related to surgery in the one anastomosis gastric bypass arm. So finally, the per protocol population on which we performed the analysis was 117 patients in both arms. So you can see after the rate of follow-up. So what were the results at 2 years? And this was the primary endpoint. The hypothesis was that one anastomosis would not be inferior to RANY in the difference in excess BMI loss. If it was less than 7% difference, it means less than 5 kilograms. And you can see here that the mean excess BMI loss in both groups was quite comparable, 87.9% in the one anastomosis arm and 85.8% in the RANY gastric bypass arm. So these are means, and so we were able to conclude that one anastomosis is not inferior to RANY. So now if we look at metabolic results at 2 years, and especially in the decrease in HbA1c, so you can see here that in the whole population, non-diabetic and diabetic, the mean decrease was significantly higher in the one anastomosis gastric bypass group, 0.7%, minus 0.4% in the RANY. And if we then looked at specifically at the type 2 diabetes population, and it was also statistically significant with a decrease of 1.9% in the one anastomosis arm compared to 0.9% in the RANY arm. So we then assessed metabolic results in terms of type 2 diabetes remission, and we used the American Diabetes Association criteria. And you can see that there were no significant difference between both arms in terms of complete and partial remission. You can see nevertheless that we had 60% of complete remission in the one anastomosis arm versus 37.5% in the RANY arm. Nevertheless, as I said, it was not statistically significant. So this was the remission. So at 1 year of follow-up, we had a warning from the safety department of clinical research regarding the rate of serious adverse events related to surgery. A serious adverse event is defined by the French and European Medicine Agency according to a standard definition, which is for all randomized trials in Europe. So a serious adverse event is defined as any untoward medical occurrence that results in death, is life-threatening, requires inpatient hospitalization or prolongation of existing hospitalization, results in significant disability, is a congenital anomaly, or is a medically significant event. So now if we look at these serious adverse events in this trial, we can see that we had nearly twice as much serious adverse events in the one anastomosis gastric bypass arm, 42, compared to 24 in the Roux-en-Y, and it was statistically significant. And if we look at in details at these these complications, you can see that they were mainly nutritional in the one anastomosis gastric bypass arm, with 9 patients with nutritional complications. It means 21.4% of these complications. In the Roux-en-Y, we had mostly abdominal pain, which was quite surprising for us, and so 20.8%. And you can also see that we had 4 revisions from one anastomosis to Roux-en-Y gastric bypass because of 1 leak, 1 Wernicke encephalopathy, and 2 biliary reflux. So these are the serious adverse events declared. If we look specifically at the nutrition, the 9 patients with nutritional complications in the one anastomosis gastric bypass arm, you can see that all of these patients had at least a vitamin deficiency and or a malnutrition and or an anemia or iron deficiency. You can see that the level of steatorrhea was quite high for the patients with data, and you can also see that the mean weight loss in these patients was high, because it was about minus 58 kilograms. So patients were losing a lot of weight. If we now look at the nutritional status at 2 years and the decrease in hemoglobin and iron, you can see that the decrease in hemoglobin was significantly higher in the one anastomosis gastric bypass arm and compared to the Roux-en-Y gastric bypass arm. But if we look at the number of anemia or iron deficiency, there was no statistical difference, significant difference, sorry, between both groups at 2 years. If we look now at malnutrition, and especially the rate of albumin inferior to 30 grams per liter, prealbumin inferior at 0.2 grams per liter, you can see that there was no statistical difference, significant difference between both arms at 2 years, but all the patients were supplemented and they had proteins in case of bad dosage. If we look now at the vitamin deficiency, PTH over 50, vitamin B1 inferior to 66, vitamin B9 inferior to 6, vitamin B12 inferior to 145, vitamin D inferior to 50, we did not find at 2 years any difference between both groups. And let's have a look to the rate of diarrhea. You can see here that it was statistically different between both groups at 3 months and 24 months, with a 26% rate of diarrhea in the one anastomosis group at 3 months, which was still high at 24 months, about 19 points, nearly 20% of the patients with diarrhea at over 24 months. If we look now at the steatorrhea, it was higher and significantly higher in the one anastomosis gastric bypass arm. You can see here 11 grams per 100 grams of stools and 7 in the Roux-en-Y gastric bypass group. Now, regarding dumping syndrome, the rate of dumping syndrome was higher in the Roux-en-Y gastric bypass group at 3 years and at 3 months, and it was statistically significant, with nearly 24% of patients with a dumping compared to 8% in the one anastomosis gastric bypass group. But at 2 years, there were no difference between both groups, with about 15% of dumping syndrome in both groups. Now, regarding GERD, there was a difference between both arms, but which was not statistically significant, with 5.6% of GERD in the one anastomosis arm compared to 1.4% of GERD in the Roux-en-Y. Now, the data of upper GI endoscopy at 2 years, you can see that we had 19% of gastritis versus 6% in the one anastomosis gastric bypass group compared to the Roux-en-Y. We had in the one anastomosis group 16% with the presence of bile in the stomach when performing the endoscopy. We had 10% of patients with esophagitis, mainly grade A. We had on biopsies 77% of normal mucosa in the one anastomosis group. And if you look at esophageal biopsies, we had at 2 years of follow-up 1 metaplasia in this group, but without dysplasia. So I didn't show the results of quality of life, but it was the same and no statistical difference between both groups at 2 years. So as a conclusion, we can say that one anastomosis gastric bypass offers similar weight loss and metabolic effects than Roux-en-Y gastric bypass. We can also say that this is a malabsorptive procedure, especially if you look at the increased rate of diarrhea and steatorrhea and to the nutritional complications. We can say, I think, that 2-meter biliopancreatic limb is at increased risk of nutritional complications and also with a high risk of serious adverse events. We have no answer yet regarding the risk of biliary reflux in the long term. And of course, I think that more randomized trials are needed with long-term data. So I want to thank all my colleagues who performed this research with us and who allow this publication. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Robert, for this detailed presentation, and congratulations on your amazing work and hard work and helping us define things scientifically. Before we go into the discussion, we're going to go into the second poll and see if the presentation actually changed the mind of the audience on one anastomosis gastric bypass. And please select the following. And I'll ask you, Professor Robert, how does this trial influence your practice?
Well, I was very enthusiastic in 2013 performing one anastomosis gastric bypass. We we published our results in obesity surgery in 2014, showing greater weight loss with the omega loop bypass compared to the Roux-en-Y gastric bypass. But with time and with this trial, after 1 year of follow-up, the warning, of the safety department, we began to see nutritional complications with the 2-meter biliopancreatic limb, and well, I think that my preference now go to the Roux-en-Y. I don't say that you don't have to do a one anastomosis gastric bypass. I cannot say that with this trial. This is not the problem. But sometimes I perform a one anastomosis gastric bypass procedure, but I think that bile is a major concern. So I'm still, waiting for long-term data.
Okay, great. And the audience actually shares your view on longer term data, and 32% will never do 200 biliopancreatic limb. Still 11% think my experience shows one anastomosis is superior to Roux-en-Y gastric bypass. But let's go into the discussion, and please, for the attendees, if you have any questions, please type in your question in the question segment. on the right-hand side, and we'll try to get to it. But we'll break down the discussion per segment. And I'll start with the methodology of the trial, if you allow me, Professor Robert.
Of course.
Did you actually, how did you choose the centers? And did you look at the experience of the centers between Roux-en-Y and one anastomosis? And do you think their experience influenced the outcomes of this trial at all?
Okay, so so we answer a call for tender, you know. So before answering this call, you have to choose the centers which will be agreed to participate. More you have centers, and more you have chances to have the tender, you know. So we selected high volume institutions who were mainly performing gastric bypass, and you know, the centers who didn't perform well-anastomosis gastric bypass were afraid of the study, so they didn't participate. So all the centers that participate to this trial were doing both techniques. We had 9 centers. We can say that 4 centers were mainly performing well-anastomosis gastric bypass. This was the case for Professor Jean-Marc Chevalier and Dr. Espalieu, who included the main number of patients in the study. They included nearly half of the patients, and 5 centers were mainly performing Roux-en-Y, even if they were also performing well-anastomosis gastric bypass.
Okay, great. And the next part in the methodology is you mentioned all patients actually had preoperative endoscopy. Was the preoperative endoscopy itself done by the centers, or was it done elsewhere and you just reviewed the outcomes? How were the actual results of the endoscopy reviewed?
In France, it is recommended to perform a systematic endoscopy before bariatric surgery, especially in case of gastric bypass, where you will have an excluded stomach. So all the patients had also gastric biopsies to seek for Helicobacter pylori before surgery. This preoperative endoscopy was among the inclusion criteria. It was specified in the protocol, so a patient couldn't be included and randomized in case of the absence of a pre-op endoscopy. These endoscopies were mainly performed by the gastroenterologist of each center, and the report form of the endoscopy had to be in the case report form of the file. It was checked by the monitoring team, which is an independent team belonging to the clinical research department. So if this inclusion and exclusion criteria, history of esophagitis, severe GERD, presence of dysplastic modification of gastric mucosa, presence of Helicobacter pylori, etc., were not found in the file, the patients couldn't provide data to the study. They were excluded.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. That's great and clear. Now, when you describe the procedures, the technique itself, you mentioned that you use a 37 French bougie in one anastomosis gastric bypass, and you do a 200 centimeter biliopancreatic limb, as opposed to the Roux-en-Y, which is anticolic only, an elementary or Roux limb of 150 and a biliopancreatic of 50 centimeters. The gastrojejunal anastomosis itself was stapled. However, the size of the stapler was not mentioned. Was it unified all throughout?
Yeah, the stapler for both techniques was between 30 to 35, maximum accepted being 45. So some surgeons like me always use 30 millimeters for the anastomosis as well as the Roux-en-Y, and some other surgeons prefer to use 45. So when you do a multi-center trial, you also have to respect the experience of your colleagues. If not, they will not participate. So the method was discussed with all the surgeons before the study during the setup visit of the study, which was compulsory. But I'm not sure that this really matters in our results, because as you can see in our results, the weight loss was good, and this was not the problem.
Yeah. Now, the way you measured the small bowel, was it unified, and how did you measure it?
The measurement was done as the surgeons do it usually. They were all experimented. So I use especially a little lac. Some others do differently. I didn't we didn't check that in
Okay.
the technique.
And any of the surgeons measured the entire small bowel at all, or no?
No,
No.
and this was not in the protocol. I think that when you operate a super obese patient, it's quite dangerous to measure
Yes.
all the bowel, so it was not recommended.
It doesn't come without risk for sure. And if you encounter something like a hiatal hernia during the procedure, was it actually fixed? And what was the percentage of added procedures done at the time?
We didn't have any added procedures as cure of hiatal hernia in the trial. We had some associated cholecystectomies, but I think that performing an endoscopy previously to surgery, severe GERD resistant to PPI, which was an exclusion criteria, probably allow us not to have this kind of things.
Now, after the procedure, you have a pathway to follow up patients, and you define the pathway pretty clearly. And one of the definitions that you actually had was patients lost to follow up. And you defined it as patients who do not have any data point throughout the periods of follow-up. And so if a patient showed up for one follow-up, was he actually not considered lost to follow-up?
No. Patients were considered as lost to follow-up if no information was obtained before database lock at 2 years minimum of follow-up. So it means that if a patient did not come at the 2 years visit, but we saw him, for example, at 18 months and then at 32 months post-op, he was not considered as lost to follow-up because we had news after 2 years. But a patient for who you have no news after 18 months was considered as lost to follow-up. So if he did the first visit, the second, the third, but not the last, and we have no news after, he is lost to follow-up.
Okay, great. And we're done with the methodology, and we'll go to the most important part, which is the results. And you expected to have 10% loss of follow-up, and that's but the rate exceeded that. What were the challenges in order to overcome such a rate? That's one. And why do you think you did not achieve what you expected?
Well, in fact, we recruited enough patients as explained in the flow chart because we had 261 patients who were included, but after, we had exclusion because of decline to participate, because of serious adverse events before surgery, because some consent were not in the file. Finally, we were able to randomize 253 patients, 124 in the Roux-en-Y gastric bypass group and 129 in the one anastomosis gastric bypass group. But again, we had to exclude some patients because of patients who did not have the good procedure, or patients who had a history of previous gastric bends. So that's how finally you lose your patients. We at 18 initially we had planned to recruit patients during 18 months, but after 18 months we didn't have enough patients, so we extended the recruitment to 24 months to have this 261 patients. But you have to know that at 24 months, when you supervise the study as the main investigator, so like me, all you are aware of before analyzing the data and looking the database is that finally you had 261 patients that were included, and that you have reached the 256 patients planned in the protocol. In a multi-center trial, there is an independent data management team that collect and check all the data, and I didn't have access to this data, so I was not able, to see what was going on. That's when we analyzed the data, I said, wow, we have 22% of loss to follow up. That's a problem.
Okay.
So,
So this is a lot of hard work for sure, and you for the primary outcome you do multiple imputations to replace and analyze the data correctly,
yeah.
up to its power. And you mentioned that you were surprised that Roux-en-Y gastric bypass had similar weight loss to one anastomosis gastric bypass. Any of the other investigators, how did they feel about the outcome?
Most of us thought that it would have been better with the one-anastomosis gastric bypass group compared to the Roux-en-Y. Nevertheless, when you look at the literature, some studies report better weight loss, and we published one, and some others find similar weight loss. So, you just have to trust your trial.
You do. And
So yeah.
did you try to analyze certain patient population, let's say BMI over 50 or over 45? Do they have an advantage in one anastomosis gastric bypass as opposed to Roux-en-Y?
We tried because personally, I thought that for patients, I still think for patients with BMI over 50 who are super obese, or for patients with severe type 2 diabetes, it can be interesting for them to have one anastomosis gastric bypass technique, especially if they are not good candidates to biliopancreatic diversion. So we tried to have a subgroup of this kind of patient, but we have not enough power. We had about 10% of super obese, 29% of diabetic patients, and so we could not conclude.
Okay. So and this study was not powered to do that analysis, let's say. And after your presentation in Obesity Week, it stirred up a lot of reactions, a lot of scrutiny. Lots of people talked on Facebook about one of the main investigators actually pulling out from the study. Were there rumors, or was it actually true?
I think that it was mainly rumors. It probably started because Jean-Marc Chevalier, very trust one anastomosis gastric bypass. But even if he's a strong supporter of the technique, Jean-Marc Chevalier which still defends this technique, totally agree with the results. According to him, a 2 meters biliopancreatic limb is too long and is responsible for the serious adverse events we observed. So he thinks that the biliopancreatic limb has to be shortened and no longer that 1.5 meters. This is what he does currently. Nevertheless, we designed this trial, as I said initially, in 2013, and at that time, 2 meter biliopancreatic limb was, the standard. So you cannot anyway withdraw your implication in a study only because the results do not please you. You know, this is clinical research, and you have
Yes.
to accept what you find. So there was no
Completely
problem.
agree. Yes, completely agree. Um, uh, so, um, as far as the secondary outcomes, and we mentioned the diabetes and metabolic, and you mentioned that you had 58 patients with diabetes, and 30 in the Roux-en-Y group, and 28 in the one anastomosis gastric bypass group. And you mentioned the remission rate and the statistical significance of decreased hemoglobin A1C in one anastomosis as opposed to the Roux-en-Y. However, you know, throughout, just because of the issues of loss of follow-up, there are more patients missing from the Roux-en-Y gastric bypass group. You know, 17 out of 30 have data. However, 13 out of 30, which is almost 43%, do not have data. Do you think that
Yeah.
influenced the outcome?
Um, I don't. I'm not sure, but I agree with you totally. But as I said, when you look at the decrease in HbA1c in the type 2 diabetes group, it was clearly significant that anastomosis gastric bypass do better than Roux-en-Y. In terms of remission, this was not statistically significant, and of course, as you said, we had missing data, but in the discussion, I didn't said, you know, that type 2 diabetes remission was better in anastomosis gastric bypass group. We just said that despite more participants achieving remission of type 2 diabetes in anastomosis gastric bypass group than Roux-en-Y, the difference was not significant. And I also said that this result might be associated with the low number of participants with type 2 diabetes included in our study, due also to missing data and probably a lack of power, as you said. But you know, you also have impressions, but you
Yeah, no,
cannot really
agreed. But
conclude.
you know, in such a great you know trial, I mean, it sets in the amount of hard work that you have to put in as a team all through just to make sure all points are met. And it's so difficult with a multi-center trial. So, you know, believe me, it's easier for me to criticize from my end for sure. The Now let's go into the complications a little bit and the adverse events. And you mentioned that the early adverse events were a little bit higher in the Roux-en-Y gastric bypass as opposed to the one anastomosis. And intraoperatively, there were two bowel injuries. Do you have any idea how those bowel injuries occurred? Were they due
Um,
to the stapler?
No, I think they were due to the manipulation of the ball when you measure it, and especially when you have heavy patients, when the mesentery is very thick. So I think that that was most of the time the case. We also had patients who were operated after history of previous abdominal surgeries, and in who the surgeon had to do an important adhesiolysis. And I think that one of the patients had a bowel injury due to the adhesiolysis.
Okay. And as far as you mentioned also, there's a stenosis in the gastrojejunal anastomosis in the one anastomosis gastric bypass group, and a hematoma that were not considered part of the major adverse events. How were they managed? And I'm actually curious to know, you know, what size stapler did that patient have?
Yeah, I think that what we learned about the case report form is that the stenosis was not a real stenosis. There was, you know, like an inflammation and an edema and the patients could eat again with medical therapy. So that's why he was not grade 3 according to Clavian classification. And the hematoma was found because the hemoglobin went down. The patient had a CT scan and he was just, followed with no treatment.
Okay, great. Now, the peritonitis mentioned in both, what were the causes?
Okay. In the one isolated gastric bypass group, we had one peritonitis due to a leak, which was also in the serious adverse events. We had one patient who had a bowel injury on the root limb and who had a peritonitis, and we had another one who had a mesenteric abscess, which was just treated with antibiotherapy.
Okay. And the small bowel obstruction in the one anastomosis gastric bypass, what was that cause?
This patient, if I remember, had several abdominal surgery before, and the surgeon did not perform a complete adhesiolysis. So 2 days after the surgery, the patient had an occlusion. So
Okay.
an obstructive bowel obstruction due to this incomplete adhesiolysis.
Okay, that's great. And when you analyzed the data eventually, did you analyze the data of each center alone or not?
I look at all the serious adverse events, all the complications after looking the database, and I don't really see any difference between one center and another one, but we did not perform statistics on that.
Okay, and
so there were no real difference, but I cannot prove it.
Okay, great. And the reason I mention it, other than technique, you see a pattern of missing data. The more complex the data is like certain blood work is not present in post-op follow-ups, and I'm wondering what were the challenges in obtaining those follow-ups between centers, because there's so much missing data, especially in the nutritional aspect of things that hinders the results of this study.
We had nearly half of the patients that were operated in private practice, another half in public practice. But sometimes, for example, for me, all the blood work is performed in hospitals, so the patients don't have to pay for it. But some other patients had to do their blood test, in a private lab, and I think that some of them probably because of what it cost didn't do it. So it just, I think, reflects real life, and we're trying now in France to work on how patients can be really well reimbursed when they have this kind of surgery, because probably it is one of the reasons for why they don't come back.
Okay. And the nutritional deficiencies and the nutritional patients who had deficiencies in one anastomosis gastric bypass, did they have difficulty in following up? Do you think any of those nutritional outcomes could have been prevented?
No, because I think that these complications arrived very rapidly. It was quite early during the follow-up, and as we saw very serious complications, these patients were hospitalized. You have to declare that you had a serious adverse event, so you have to follow them. So they were well followed. But when they go back to their home, you can never be sure of the observance of the treatment. Did they really take the vitamins? It's difficult to prove that also, but no, these 9 patients were really well followed.
Okay. And the diarrhea somehow was more prominent in the first 3 months, but however, not so at 2 years. Do you think it's an adaptability? Did some of the patients actually have less diarrhea at 2 years in one anastomosis gastric bypass?
I don't think. I think that patients they just change their behavior. If they just change what they eat because they don't want to have so many stools. So I think that the behavior is changing. So I think that's why it's improving with time. I think that also there is a complaint of the patient. So he come to your visit and he said, I have a lot of stools. It's difficult. So you try to treat them. So you sometimes you give antibiotics against the bacterial overgrowth and it works. Sometimes you give pancreatic enzymes and it works. So you just try to find the best for them, and sometimes it works. So I think that's why it's improving.
That's good. And as far as the dumping, actually surprised and actually commend you on mentioning dumping, because whenever I ask anyone who's doing one anastomosis gastric bypass, they say they don't have dumping at all, and uh, we see the lower rate of dumping, but it's not statistically significant at 2 years. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think that at 3 months, it's better in the one anastomosis gastric bypass group because the pouch is longer, and I think that the foods are arriving later than in the Ren-Y gastric bypass group in the bowel, small bowel. So that's probably why physiologically you can explain that. But I think that even when you perform a Ren-Y, you have a high rate of dumping, but you all know that after 6 months it's going better because again patients change their behavior. They eat differently, they eat less sugar, and I think that's why finally you have a lower rate in the one anastomosis gastric bypass group early at 3 months, and it is statistically different, but at 2 years the rate is the same in both groups because everybody has changed his behavior. I think that's the reason why.
And the the reflux, the GERD, it's a little bit more in the one anastomosis gastric bypass. However, it's not statistically significant between both. However, you do have 9 patients in one anastomosis gastric bypass with bile reflux, and you have 1 patient with grade C esophagitis. And the 2 patients underwent conversion to Roux-en-Y gastric bypass. Were these conversions part of the same 9 patient population that had bile in their stomach or no?
No,
So
because if you have a one anastomosis gastric bypass group, if you are in the one anastomosis group and then you are converted to the Roux-en-Y, you disappear from the per protocol analysis because you have a severe problem, so which is a major deviation from the protocol. So they are in the intention to treat population, but you cannot leave them in the per protocol analysis. And the data that you can see on the endoscopy, these are from the patients who have, who are in the per protocol analysis. So the 2 conversions are 2 more patients finally.
Okay. And were there any patients that actually were treated medically and successfully happy with bile reflux symptoms in one anastomosis, because it's not mentioned in the paper?
Yeah, we try to always treat them before with medical therapy, because if not, you have to reoperate them. So that's, a second surgery. So no, we always try to treat them medically, but for my patients with one anastomosis gastric bypass, I try, to make them aware that probably they have no reflux now, but that it can come later. And if it comes later, we will have to perform endoscopies just to follow them. It doesn't mean that I will convert them if they well tolerated and then there are no changes on the endoscopy, but I think that you have to follow them.
Okay. Well, two final questions actually. After this long work and long journey, 6 years you mentioned, of
Yeah.
putting the trial, following up patients, and analyzing the results. Are you planning to do long-term follow-up on these patients or not?
Well, my team and I think the others are following the patients in the long term, but to collect and monitor this data according to the law in France, we need a new agreement of the patients. We need a new agreement from an ethics committee and the French medical agency, and we also need financial support. If you want to do blood tests and check the data, have a statistician, the independent team. So that means that you have to do another study, So, well, we all follow our patients, but I'm not able to follow the patients of the others because I have no money,
Well, hopefully we'll recruit some money for you. Now, what do you think are the strength points of this trial, and the weak points of the trial? And if you had to do it all over again, what would you do better?
Okay. So the strength is that this is the first multi-center randomized trial with a previously published protocol on official sites. So we had also an independent monitoring team, an independent statistician team. So it guarantees your results. Even if 2 randomized trials have been published before, the added value of ours is that it's the methodological rigor. All the data, as I said, were monitored by independent data management team, and the statistics were also done by an independent team. This study was specifically designed to answer actively debated issues as the nutritional risk and biliary reflux exposure after one-service gastric bypass, which still fueled the controversy, which were not assessed by previous studies. This is also the first report of endoscopic data with biopsies at 2 years of follow-up, giving comparative and objective data regarding biliary reflux exposure. Another added value of our study is to have collected these objective data to assess secondary endpoints as self-administered questionnaire, to assess gastrointestinal side effects, GERD, dumping syndrome and quality of life, dosage of steatoria, and complete nutritional biological workup, even if we had missing data. So if I had to do it again, what are the weaknesses and what I will do differently? Well, we did our best with lots of research assistants involved in the monitoring and control of data. I would definitely not choose a 2 meters biliopancreatic limb, but probably a shorter length of 1.5 meters. I still don't know how to improve the follow-up, but we are currently working on the topic with the National Healthcare Insurance. And in this case here, we should have planned probably more inclusions to avoid the insufficient statistical power due to the 22% rate of loss to follow-up.
Well, Professor Robert, it's a privilege and an honor, and I thank you on everything that you did throughout the study, this presentation, showing us, the truth behind the study and not hiding anything, which is commendable for sure. And before we close, we're going to have one last poll and see if the discussion changed your point of view. And with that, we'll launch. Please select the following. Would you ever consider using a percentage rather than a fixed length? I know it's tough to measure the entire small bowel.
In the reservoir trial, they adapted the length of the biliopancreatic limb to the total length of the bowel, but no, because what I think is what is responsible for malnutrition is the length of the biliopancreatic limb. I really think that is the problem. So the longer you do the biliopancreatic limb, the longer you will have problem. This is also why biliopancreatic diversion works so well, because the length of the biliopancreatic limb is very long.
Yes. And with that, we'll close the poll. And 53% of patients say we need 150 centimeter. I say we need randomized controlled trials to assess the 150. And 12% unfortunately do not believe in the results of this trial. Well, hopefully at least they'll do things scientifically on their own and find out any missing points of this study. Professor Robert, it was a pleasure. Thank you very much. And
thank you.
Final announcement. Next week, we're going to hold our first IFSO Global Twitter chat on stigma against obesity, the perception of obesity. Please join us April 23rd, 8:30 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time. Professor Robert, the invitation is to you as well. Thank you, Manuela, and the IFSO team in the background, and we'll see you next month.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.